welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and I'm really excited to welcome back the author of Like Mother, Like Daughter, Kimberly McCreight. We were just talking about how the last time we chatted, it was really deep in the pandemic times, right?
It was. I remember being like, then even you had like a fancy backdrop like you do now. And I was like, ooh, there's backgrounds. It was like back in the day where like we didn't know, none of us knew Zoom very well. So,
and now we know it so well. But
well.
I am happy to have you back. Please tell us about this book.
Real, thank you so much for having me again. Yeah, Like Mother, Like Daughter opens in Park Slope, Brooklyn with Cleo, who is a college student at NYU, reluctantly returning home for dinner. Her mother has been, they've been estranged and their relationship has been bumpy for a while. And she's finally agreed to come back home from dinner. And when she gets there, she walks in and the food is burning on the stove and there's no sign of her mother. And she finds a bloody shoe. And that kind of sets off the story, which is narrated from the points of view of Cleo and her mother, Kat. And Cleo's point of view is in the days following Kat's disappearance, and Kat's is in the days leading up to it. And through their dual narration, you find out what happened to Kat, but you also kind of see the evolution of their relationship, which was once very close when Cleo was young and now is kind of in this fractured place. So it's a lot about that relationship as much as it is a mystery.
I think it really opens on this really strong note about just parenthood in general and just some of like the drivel that people tell you about it before you actually become a mother. You'll know what to do when the time comes. And I mean, it's like somebody just walked down the greeting card aisle and picked out every cliche possible. And maybe it is like that for some people, but I feel like the majority of people don't have that experience. And then, obviously, even if you do and you think everything is going to be a perfect situation, when you get down to it and when you actually start parenting, it just never goes the way you think it's going to.
Well, and certainly not consistently, right? Like, perhaps for a year or two. I feel like everyone has their season with parenting. It's like you either have a really easy pregnancy and then a very hard baby, or the reverse, or everything's great and perfect. And then you have a teenager and that's hard. And a lot of it depends not only on your child, but you, right? So some people I think are of a natural inclination towards, I have a friend who like loves babies. This I do not understand, but she loves babies. And so for her, having those phases were easiest. And it's not even that her children were easy. It was just that she gravitated towards that. So I do think that those, obviously I opened the book with the prologue that you're referring to about this kind of trite colloquialisms that we are all told. And it's really not even when you're pregnant, it's the entire time. And so I feel like whenever you're struggling with something, I feel like the number of people who just want to pontificate about the how and the why, and these are people often who have children themselves. And so who should know better, because there are no answers. And I think the best we can hope for is to empathize with each other and to emphasize that there is no easy way through at any point.
So Kat and Cleo are obviously very similar and very different, as the title would suggest. But Kat, she comes off to Cleo as extremely controlling and wants everything to be perfect. And when you kind of hear her point of view, she sort of hates that. And, obviously she has her own reasons for reacting the way she does. She doesn't have a background like Cleo does, which is this well-off, seemingly stable family that can afford to just send her to NYU. And she really pushes back, whereas Kat grew up in the foster system and never really had that sort of stability. That said, Kat has a really interesting job, and she is a fixer, and her for a law firm, and they are working on a case that is a high profile pharmaceutical case, which I did a little research because I was like, this sounds a little familiar. And then there are some connections to other cases that I've been reading about. But there's so many things that you find out about Kat's life, or that Cleo begins to find out about Kat's life, that could have something to do with her disappearance. And then obviously Cleo has her own stuff going on, some of the own poor choices that she's making. How did the two characters feel as you were writing them out? Was there a lot of tension within the writing, or like, did you know immediately what their relationship was going to be like?
It's funny that you said that there was some real life things with the cases, because I should do my own Googling, because that's funny, because I will after this podcast now. So it wasn't actually referencing anything, but I'm not surprised to hear that there is something like that in real life. So to answer your question about the characters, I come at the characters, I think, a little bit like an actor does. Like, I really inhabit them when I'm writing from their point of view. So it just naturally started that way. I think I actually began with Cleo's point of view. I write chronologically, so I was alternating between them, and her voice was just that right away. And I knew that the tension would be in the disconnect between them. I didn't know all the details of it. And their problems are certainly not the problems I've had with my own daughters, but some of it came from me knowing intuitively the push-pull and the complications about, like, where you have been, where your children begin, which is usually a different place than you came from, and whether that's financially or economically or what have you. So I knew that tension would exist immediately. But when I'm in each character, I don't feel like I'm not questioning how that character sees the world, because I'm like, yes, I am that character. So I'm like, yes, this is the way the world is. Although I do think Cleo, to a lesser extent, because she's younger, but I think Kat kind of knows from the outset that her point of view is limited. She's questioning, if anything, she questions herself too much, I think, throughout the whole book. So, and Cleo eventually gets there where she starts to question her own point of view. So that is really, I think, built into me, again, being in the skin of the characters.
So some of the people who play into the situation, there is Kat's estranged husband, who I have feelings about.
A lot of people have feelings about Aiden.
Yeah, and then there's also Cleo's boyfriend, who there's also feelings about. Were you writing their relationships with men sort of as foils for each other, or did that also kind of come up organically?
It's all organic. I don't outline in advance at all. And I think that allows me a lot of flexibility and really allows it to be organic. I do have a sense broadly of like where I'm headed and the structure. So I start with this kind of question about the intersection between this mother and daughter's lives and how it's going to evolve. I know the plot arc, meaning, she's missing. There will have to be a figuring out of what what happened to her. So I have a sense of those things, and the rest of it really just evolves as I write. So you're saying that now, and it's always interesting to talk to people once the book is finished and it's out, because I'm like, oh, that's true. There is a mirroring. Like I didn't even see that at the time when I was writing it. But of course, if you're really knowing your characters and writing from an intuitive place and their point of view, it's going to deliver you there, because of course they are a mother and a daughter. And so they're going to have those similarities, whether it's as a result of being raised in the same home or the genetics or whatever it is. So yeah, no, I don't plan any of that in advance. And I think if I did, it would come across very clunky and forced. And so, and it also, and not outlining, which I'm a big proponent of, although I think obviously wonderful books can be written by outlining, it does mean you're not attached to anything. So all those pieces weren't necessarily in that order and in those places in the early drafts, right? So, but because I'm not attached to an outcome, I don't have an outline. I don't care. As I'm doing something and it's not working, I'm like, this isn't working. I need to invert something or look at it a different way or try another approach.
So I think that is one of my favorite things to hear. Not that I have anything against people who are really big on plotting, but I think there really is sort of something to reading something where the author has a problem and needs to solve them as the characters. You're putting your characters in these situations and they need to find their way out or not but it needs to unfold the way that with the thinking process. I think that that's always very interesting to hear. One thing I did want to ask about is also Kat's job as a fixer. For those who are not in tune with that word and do not know what it means, what is it and how did you know that this was going to be the type of work that she does?
Yeah, so I mean, a fixer is essentially, it could be a PR person, it could be somebody at a law firm. It's essentially somebody who's going to help a client of a law firm, or again, a PR client who has some sort of issue that can't be solved in the court system. So you have to basically, it's a company, it's using the legal system, writing letters, asking questions, interviewing people, threatening legal action maybe, or responding to the threat of legal action. But it doesn't involve actually, you have to employ a lot of other skills rather than just lawyer skills. So the other piece of your question was, how did I know that she would be that? Is I think for me, it really is a metaphor. To me, every mother is a fixer. And so I feel that all the time. I feel like my daughters are coming to me, they're like, this thing just happened their whole life, And I think this is true for all mothers. And you're like, great. So like, how am I going to make XYZ happen? And these obviously are not situations where your children have done things that are going to land them in the newspaper, but they need help with something. And particularly if you're a parent in New York City, these systems aren't easy to move around. So you have to be able to be agile and use different skills. And so it was meant to be both a fun engine for a plot, for a legal thriller, but also I do think it's a broader metaphor for motherhood.
So the pacing is really cool. And you use, I don't know if mixed media is the correct term for it, but I think that's the closest I can really use. There's the narrative, and then there's journal entries, and there's transcripts from therapist sessions that help push the story along. And it works really well for the pacing. Was that something that you had planned on doing, or did that again come up while you were writing that it needed almost like, because when you write a book that's from different perspectives, you kind of come out with that, I suppose, Rashomon type story where it's one person sees something one way, the other person sees the same scenario, but gets something different out of it. But when you're using a different medium where it's almost like there's another set of eyes on it, or it's a bird's eye view, it kind of usually comes right down the middle. Was that what you were trying to accomplish with the changes?
Yeah, so I've always used, and I think mixed media or interstitial elements, I usually call them, is the right way to refer them in every single one of my books, except I guess maybe my YA trilogy didn't have that, but every adult book has had that. And they're different depending on which book. Reconstructing Amelia, there was a lot of social media things and texting and what have you. So it's always the way I've conceived of a story. And in part, I'm not like, let me put interstitial element, like, again, there's no way you could write a book with that, like coming at it with that intention. I don't think it wouldn't feel, organic or real. It's just the way I see story and see experiences really kind of from this 360 point of view. And inevitably there will be pieces of the story that you can't really get in unless you're going to make them flashbacks or somebody talking about XYZ. For instance, there are journal entries in this book from Kat growing up, and I could have made them flashbacks. There are some flashbacks to her growing up, but there's just an immediacy to those multimedia elements where really you can hear the voice of them at a different time in a different setting. There's also therapy transcripts for Cleo where you really, you are getting like a peeking behind the curtain kind of thing, and a character in a different setting. And so you're getting a different view on them. And they're never put in for me in a haphazard way. They're always intended to either round out a character or give you more information or to build on a plot thread. And I hope that it's meant to be kind of give this orchestral sense of the story existing not just from those characters' point of view, which I think is limited, which is why I always write from multiple points of view. It shows that there's even more than points of view. There's them with a point of view in a different setting, which makes them seem different.
Did you have a particular perspective in this book that you enjoyed writing more than another? Like, did you prefer Kat to Cleo? Their voices were both really strong and came out very authentic.
Well, thank you. Cleo's easier. In general, people that are removed from you, I find, I don't know what other writers find, I find the characters that are closest to me to be the most challenging, because you have to make sure you're not defaulting to yourself. Like that's the inclination when either it's a real bad character, like there was a character in Where They Found Her, my second book, Barbara, who was just not a nice person. And so if you can either be in a baddie or like somebody who's in a different age than you and a really different point of view, and Cleo is kind of a little difficult at the beginning. So it allows you to just really let you disappear entirely into that character. So the ones like Kat, it's like bringing up your own stuff as you're writing it. And so you have to kind of you can use some of that, but you have to make sure you keep it separate.
Are you a big thriller reader yourself? Do you have any favorites, or are you one of those authors who prefers to not read within the genre they write?
Yeah, I'm more of a not read in my genre type. I mean, I do obviously for work, to give blurbs to people. I don't like reading my genre, and for a couple of reasons. Mostly, we're all living in the zeitgeist, right? All of us writers. And so we have the same ideas because consciously or unconsciously, they're in the ether, right? And who knows where they come from, where it comes from your own life, maybe, or maybe we all heard something. So I don't like to know what else is out there. And also in terms of structure and what I'm doing that may or may not be innovative. I think it's innovative and I don't know. And so I would be saddened if I read something that was what I had planned to do next and then didn't do it. Because there's room for all of us to do a lot of similar things. We're going to do it differently, right? So that's a piece of it. Also, I do spend all my time really, it feels more like work. I'm very aware of watching what another author is doing and why they're doing it. And either I'm like, oh, my book is terrible by comparison, or, I find myself puzzling over their choices. So I kind of prefer, like, I'm almost done on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is gorgeous. And it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything related to my work when I'm reading those things.
Was there anything that came up, and you don't have to say what, obviously, because we don't want spoilers, but while writing the book that really surprised you, that came out of left field?
There always is. I'm trying to remember, because then over time, when I work on a book, it becomes part of the book. Like, it's hard to remember that it was surprising. So I'm not going to be able to tell you at this point because it feels like it's all now the way it always was. But I will tell you that the best part of writing the way I write and writing without an outline is the moment when things click into place unexpectedly, where I finally do connect two threads that seemed like they were totally separate. And I'm quite sure that happened in this book too. In fact, I think the major twist was one that I certainly didn't go in with an intent. I'm not going to give away what that is, but I actually didn't go in with that figuring it would end that way necessarily. So yeah, so those things are the best moment. And that's when you realize you're really writing on an unconscious level as well as a conscious level. And it's very satisfying.
You know what I also wanted to ask? How much editing do you do after you get to the end, as somebody who lets the narrative take them in whatever direction it wants to go?
Yeah, so much. So that's the downside to writing in this fashion, is that all your heavy lifting, I mean, the people who outline their heavy lifting is in the outlining, I'm presuming that they sit around and have to figure out. I'm like, oh, this is so great, this writing thing. I'm just writing. And then you go back and look at it, you're like, what in God's name is this thing that I just made that makes no sense? So I have a complete draft of my next book, first draft. So I'm editing it now. So I can tell you that it's really manual. It feels like you're really heavy lifting. Like I get to whole chapters and I'm like, this is, because by the end of my first draft, what I have figured out is really who the characters are, really, and why they did the things they did. But it takes me to get to the whole end of a first draft to really know that, because I have to get, as we've talked about, to places where this doesn't make sense, this doesn't add up, it's got to be a different answer. So I have to stress test it. So then when I'm going back and revising, there's points at which the character, I had them doing totally the wrong thing at the beginning of the book based on who I know them to be now. So it's almost it's a wholesale rewrite, but I have a whole big document, so it feels a little less scary having that.
Thank you so much. Is your next book going to be out next year then?
No, I don't think next year, probably the year after. It's usually many months of me revising, but I do have the draft, and it's called Someone Else's Husband, and I'm excited about it.
Thank you so much, Kimberly McCreight. Thank you for joining us again. Please come back and chat with us about that one.
Thank you so much for having me. I absolutely will.
And listeners, check this book out either at your local library or head on over to a bookstore. If you are a beach reader, this is a good beach read. If you are a pool reader, this is a good pool read. If you just want to read someplace air conditioned, you will love it. It doesn't matter. This book, like Mother, Like Daughter, is definitely a wonderful domestic thriller that takes you to some emotional places. So once again, this was Jessica, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.